to start off?
Okay, yeah, welcome everybody. My name's John Smith. I'm a chartered architectural technologist as part of the Institute. I'm also one of the, well, I've registered as an HRB and non-HRB principal designer, and I'm one of the assessors for the Institute as well. That's me.
Okay, thanks, John. My name's Peter Schofield. Similarly to John, I'm MCIAT and principal designer registered, but for non-HRB. So John's HRBs, I'm non-HRBs. Obviously, he's much brighter than I am. So I'll give the presentation. John's going to jump in on the HRB stuff. So we might as well start off. So basically, what we're going to do is just go through basically what BSA is roughly about, because with the applications that we're receiving for registration they don't seem to understand and recognise that it's far more than building regs. So that's what we're trying to get to on this. So I apologise, there's a bit of repetition in some of these slides. We'll make it go as quickly as possible so we can answer a lot of questions. But what we're seeing is that people are just looking at building regulation compliance, and that's it. And BSA is far more than that. So going through the content, we'll look at the comparison between Building Safety Act and CDM, what the competence requirements are, behaviours, which is where that's the difference between CDM and BSA, and where can you start the process for registration and what your thought process was built. So hopefully it will give you a bit more of a guidance on what this is all about and what you should be thinking about as you make the applications. So what I've said there is, making an application is daunting. We've all been there. We've all done this. In fact, we sat there in the CIAT office, grilling each other on this. So, you're getting off lightly, to be honest. So the things that you're probably going through your mind are, the required competencies appear ambiguous. Okay, hopefully today will help you a little bit more to understand what this is all about. You're not sure if your experience is sufficient or relevant. I can tell you, as chartered architectural technologists, your technical experience and knowledge is very relevant, but it might be your behaviours and whatever that you need to look at to be able to successfully complete registration. You've got a fear of failure. I've been there. I used to teach at South Bank Uni in the old Brixton School of Building and whatever. I know what it's like. This hopefully will help you a bit more. It's not a failure. You don't have to be an expert in everything. You just have to have a ground knowledge of it, and then the skills to actually achieve a safe building. The other thing is there's very little guidance available from the building safety regulator. And when I'm talking guidance, there's loads of bits and pieces out there about HRBs and gateways and God knows what. The building safety regulator is obviously struggling, but what they're not doing is giving examples of what's good, what looks good, what you should be doing, etc. They've left it to the industry to do it, and everyone's struggling. So you're not the only ones. And what I've said is, don't worry, this session should help you understand the principal designer role and the competencies for successful application. We're not going to provide you with any technical answers, only triggers to hopefully make you feel more confident that you can and will succeed. Okay.
I think sorry, Peter,
on
that one, I think it is, don't worry, but yes, it is difficult, and there is a reason behind it being difficult, because it is a very onerous and legal role. So.
Yeah. So I'll just give you a little bit of a background. Obviously, you've all heard of Dame Judith Hackett's review and whatever. There was a few bits in there that, there's over 50 recommendations made, but there was, I've picked out 4 there. And it's improving the focus on building safety. One of the issues that everyone's getting is this kind of distinction between CDM and BSA. And it is difficult to understand, and hopefully we'll answer a few questions, and there'll be some stuff in here that'll help. The other one is setting out demanding expectations around improved levels of competence. So BSA requires behaviours as well as skills, knowledge, experience, and organisational capability. So there's a lot of stuff out there on behavioural competence. Creating a golden thread of information. I know it says in the regulations that golden thread is only HRBs, or it only refers to HRBs, but actually part of the your behavioural side is that what we're trying to do, or what the regs want you to do, is to create a record of what you're doing as a golden thread on non-HRBs as well. So that's part of it. And the other one is ensuring continuous improvement and best practice. Okay, so current applications. So this is applications for registration. And I've said it's evident that the majority of applications received that candidates are focusing on purely on the building regulations side of it. I'm a chartered technician. I understand the building regulations, which you obviously do. You use them every day. I go to design team meetings. I might not run them, but I go to the design team meetings, and that makes me a principal designer. Okay, that's what we're trying to dispel today. We need you to think a little bit wider than that when you make your applications. Okay, so I've said here, having the skills, knowledge, and experience to design in compliance with the building regulations, it's only part of the evidence you need to demonstrate competence to undertake the BSA-PD role. The behaviours you exhibit are the starting point. Okay, and that's what people are missing. So hopefully this will give you the start. Okay, I said that BSA 2022 requires improved transparency within the industry and more accountability. It is essential that all stakeholders in organisations of every size and type understand their obligations. Now, this is taken straight out of the guidance, and it says the PD shall plan, manage and monitor. So when you look at building regulation compliance, yes, you understand the building regulations, but I've missed a comment out there, as a PD, you need to plan. So how are you going to manage building regulation compliance? What are everyone's responsibilities under that? How are you going to monitor it, measure it? How are you going to keep a record of it? Yeah, what do you hand over to the client so that they can manage the building properly at the end of the day? That is planning, managing and monitoring. And what we're finding is that you're doing the managing bit, but there's no planning there. There's been successful applications, which is great, but the people who are being deferred are not understanding the full extent of what this is all about. Okay, so the PD shall plan, manage and monitor the design work during the design phase and coordinate matters relating to the design work comprised in the project so that all reasonable steps are taken to ensure that the design is such that if the building work to which the design for the project relates were built in accordance with the design, the building work would be in compliance with the relevant requirements. Okay, that's what it says in the regs. Basically, it is building regulation compliance. Okay, so I've said here that the principal designer must, under the building regulations, you must plan, manage, monitor design work and cooperate, coordinate and communicate the 3 C's to ensure the design work, if built, complies with building regulations. The PD must ensure that records are available to the responsible person. That's the person who's running the building, managing the building, to ensure the building continues to be safe throughout its life. That's the golden thread bit. Okay.
I think what we need to include in that is that it's not just about you as a potential PD, but it's about your ability to discuss and manage with other designers as part of this process as well. And it's about how you've show us those sort of interactions and where you've come up with conflict, or how you've dealt with a project and how you track it and how you manage it is just as important.
Yeah. And we'll pick up at the end of this session, we'll pick up, there's a couple of slides here I've got there, which will pick up some of the thought processes I went through. And, you know, you should be asking yourself, you know, how do I do this? How do I achieve cooperation, coordination and communication between people, between the stakeholders? I added this one, John, last night, because I thought this said a bit more. John hasn't seen this one. So, you know, what's the difference between a principal designer under the Building Safety Act and a principal designer under CDM? And it is quite confusing, to be honest. But basically, it says under the Building Safety Act, the principal designer is in control of all the design work, whereas the CDM one, it's control over the pre-construction phase of the project. Okay, what does that mean? So basically, what they're saying is that the BSA-PD is responsible for the building regulations throughout design, construction, and handover. And the principal designer for CDM is basically for pre-construction, so any design work which secures health, safety, and it should be welfare, but they didn't put welfare in the statement. So you'll see on here that the principal designer CDM needs to take account of the general principles of prevention. Okay, whereas that's not picked up in the BSA side. I was trying to think of some examples of where we are. So for argument's sake, just finished a job where we've got external retaining walls with planting above. There's a risk falls from height. That's not picked up in Part K of the building regulation because it's outside the building, but it is part of the workplace regulations and work at height regulations. So there you can see you not only got CDM, but you've got BSA as well. Okay, so there is a distinguishing, it's distinguished between the two roles, but they are mutual. Okay, you have to understand the health and safety principles of prevention, and you have to understand BSA building regulations. Is that fair enough, John?
Yeah, I think so. The way kind of I've been thinking about it is that in terms of, say, structure, you have a steelwork design for a building, and you would meet the requirements of Part A for that structure, and that would be, so the structure, there's no disproportionate collapse, it meets the requirements for the loads it's going to take, but how it's actually constructed on site, that's your CDM element. So you might need craneage, you might need safe working practices. That's not Building Safety Act, that's CDM. That's kind of how I look at the difference.
Yeah, that's fair enough, John. Thanks. So I've given a bit of a background on competence here. So the two documents you need to look at is BS 8670, which was issued this year. It was the old Flex document that they turned into a British standard, which has got the competence frameworks. And then there's also PAS 8671, which is the competence requirements for being a principal designer. And in 8670, I've picked out what the competencies are. I mean, it's obvious. So this is what 8670 talks about, and this is what 8671 is, and they've ticked them off. And you can see it's behavioural stuff, which we'll talk about in a minute, legislative stuff, management, and your technical. So we're getting lots of applications for the technical side, and some with bits of management in there, and obviously the legislative side. But we're not. It's not this holistic. We're not getting the whole story, what you're doing and how you're doing it. Is that fair, John?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think some of the submissions we've had, we're just getting shown, oh, I sent an email to X. That doesn't tell us the story.
No, I've got ones with here's a load of drawings that I've produced, but that's not what we're after.
Yeah, how does that show you're competent to have those conversations with a problem client or contractor, and how did it get resolved? Yeah, it's making sure that you're confident in yourself to be able to manage others as much as.
Yeah, and it's how's that recorded, how's that passed on to people, how you're tracking it. Those are the types of thought processes you should be going through. Okay, so the behaviours you exhibit are the starting point. So I added one on this again last night, John. So I've said about the competencies which is spoken about in 8670 and 8671. Your starting point really is to look at what the candidate guidance notes are, because it does say in there roughly what they're looking for. Okay, you need to expand on it, but it does give you a good idea. And then look at those two documents, as we've been saying. And then John put on be prepared to be questioned, because, as part of your interview, you will be questioned on how do you do this? How do you do that? Okay.
And it's
go on.
Sorry.
Go on, John, you go for that bit.
And that's the way, obviously, when we're looking at new submission for assessment to be on the register, we're looking at your submission, and then we're asking those questions of your submission, if you like. So we'll read through all your information, and we'll be saying to ourselves, has this person demonstrated how they've met whatever the question is? And it's questioning yourself and your own knowledge, and just being honest with yourself and going, oh, do I know that? Do I know how to do that? What do I need to know? As much as, yes, I can do that. So it's not just about the design and the technical design, but it's about the process that's behind it. And I think that's quite a lot of Building Safety Act, is how you record, register, monitor, so that if anyone was to ever come back in the future, unlike what happened at Grenfell, nobody had any information anywhere, nobody could provide anything, that there is a factual train of information all the way through.
Yeah, a couple of things on that is one is another document really useful to you is the Building Regulation Amendment Regulations, which is part of the secondary legislation that was made under the Building Safety Act. So the Building Safety Act is an umbrella document. It's a bit like the Health and Safety at Work Act. And the Building Regulation Amendment Regulations, especially around Section 2, Regulation 11, there's a load of stuff there on competencies and what the requirements are for each stakeholder. Yeah, so that's a really good place to go. Okay, so where do you start? So before making an application for registration, you must evaluate the limits of your own competence. So the first question is, I forget what the actual wording was, but basically it's requiring you to undertake a self-assessment of your own competencies. Okay, and as I put it, as Confucius put it, to know what you know and what you don't know that's the true knowledge. So as I said to you, you're not expected to be an expert in everything. You're supposed to have a grounding on everything such that you can actually manage the process. You might not have all the answers, and it might be when you do a self-assessment, you might say, well, I'm good at this and I'm not good at that. I did that exact thing when I I started this process, and I said, okay, what am I good at? You know, part B, I'm not that good at because I haven't used it in anger for a while because I'm a CDM principal designer ostensibly. Whilst I do know the building regulations, they've changed slightly since I used them in anger. So I went out and got someone in-house to do that. And that's what it is. How do you manage it? Find out, you do a gap analysis. What you're good at, what you're not good at. And I've said there, be honest with yourself. You're not expected to be an expert in everything. The point is that you recognize what you don't know and how to deal with it. You won't be marked down if you say, I'm not good at this, but this is how I'm going to deal with it. That's a big tick. There's your behaviors. Schedule out and honestly answer the competencies for principal designers described in those two documents that I talked to you, 8671 and 8670. Okay. This was your one, John. This was one you're going to jump in on.
Damn.
Or do you want me to do it?
No, it's fine. It's all good. So I think just following on, the behavioural competence is one of the key elements, and it's the whole process. You might recognise that actually you don't have the skill set and you don't have the experience. So from that point forward, you're looking at your behavioural competence, and if you can go, oh, actually, I now know I don't understand these things. That's a good start. It might not be that the HRB element is right for you. It might be that actually we're just looking at non-HRB and I can show that I've got the behavioural competence to put these things in place. So that's a great starting point and a great tick.
One of the behaviours as well, sorry, John, one of the behaviours as well you need to think about is how do you decide how you're going to take or what work you're going to take on?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're competent to do it, and then if your practice is actually just moving on from that, able to do it in terms of your PI. So it's not just looking at yourself, but looking at your business, and might not be your business, but the your company's ability to take on those roles, and what experience you've got in the company if you don't have that element in there as well. So in terms of legislative and regulatory framework compliance, you must be able to not necessarily know everything about the Act, because nobody does, but it's about knowing where to find the relevant bits of information for what you need to do. And that's as much as the role as sort of doing the job. It's knowing that you don't know, or knowing that you do know, or knowing where to find what you don't know.
Yeah. And the legislation and regulatory stuff is not just building regs. It's all the guidance that is out there, industry guidance, and it includes the secondary legislation, the guidance to regulations, attestations such as BBA agreement certificates, it's CDM, health and safety stuff. It's the whole gambit. It's all of it. You need to be thinking, how is this regulation? What else informs a good design, a safe design?
Absolutely, and that's what comes on to management of design work compliance. So yes, you can show that you've done the design and your behavioural competencies, but then how have you tracked the design through the process? And it might be that, say you're looking at just some fire doors, for instance, you will then know that you need to be able to back that up and say why you've put the fire doors in there. Well, is it because of part B? Is it because your fire engineer has given you sort of a specification for doing that? And what documentation is behind that to prove why you've done it and what you've done? And showing us that working is part of the submission. So
yeah, I mean, remember, talking on from what John's saying there, is remember you've got the regulation 38 fire information to issue at the end. So what you're going to put in that? Yep. If you haven't got a chartered fire engineer on board, and let's face it, you don't need it on every job, because you should be competent as chartered technologists to be able to comply with Part B. If you are compliant with Part B and you haven't got the engineer on board, what information are you going to provide? You've got to provide that information like you would have from a chartered engineer. If you've not seen a fire engineering report, then go out and see if you can get one, just as an example to show you what they're picking up, means of escape and unprotected areas and etc., etc. And it describes it all in there, what the basis of the design is, so that somebody can go and do the fire risk assessment under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Act. That's what it's about.
Yeah. And then in terms of technical frameworks, it's being able to understand the general principles of design, general principles of construction. So again, you don't have to know absolutely everything, and that's, nobody can be expected to reel off all the building regs, but it's understanding those principles. And you might not be designing, as we've just said, for fire. It might be the specialist, but you've got to be able to question and review what they've done competently.
Yeah, so and make sure it's being picked up in the design.
Yeah, absolutely.
So many times I've been issued a fire strategy document from a specialist, and there's caveats in there which have not been picked up by the design team.
And it's being able to question. One of the other things in there is the competence of others. So how would you look at that in terms of the overall guidance notes? Have you done that previously? Have you looked at the competence of others as part of your role? If not, how would you do it? What does that mean? So there's a myriad of items that you have to look at throughout this whole process, but it's reviewing what you know and what you don't know to get to a good point to be able to do a submission.
Yep. Okay, John, next one.
Yep.
So providing evidence for your applications. So the majority of required competencies do not relate to understanding the building regulations. Although if you look at some of the applications we've had, that's all you're referring to. We've got a lot of people that are referring to CDM as well, which there are some crossovers there. If you are a CDM principal designer, you will understand the process and the requirements, a lot of the requirements under Building Safety Act, but you need to be proving to the assessor that you understand and do that for the Building Safety Act, not for CDM. Okay. You also need experience and a range of skills to plan, manage, and monitor. I said it reiterates all the way through. It's this planning, managing, and monitoring, which follows HSG 65, which is Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's exactly the same thing. They just called it differently for some reason. That's the HSE for you. And how you monitor design work and cooperate, coordinate, and communicate, blah, blah, blah. We've just gone through that. Okay. Don't ignore the safety aspect. Okay. It's not just building regulations. Think about the systems, processes, and soft skills you employ. So how do you achieve consensus in a design team? Okay. There's lots of ways of doing it. I'm sure if you're running design team meetings and you are the lead designer on jobs, you've got those skills and behaviors in there. It's just how do you put it down on a piece of paper? Your behaviors are important. Again, we reiterate that. Statements should be succinct and to the point, because I get bored of reading lots of waffle. Just need to know what you're doing and that you can do it, and you've got examples of what you do. And if you make a statement, back it up with specific evidence, not just copies of drawings. We know you can do drawings. You're a chartered architectural technologist, but how do you manage that? What do you do with it? Do you just do a drawing and stick it on a common data environment and let everyone deal with it? No, you need to ensure people understand it, and if there's some coordination that needs to be done with structures, etc., that is done. How do you do that? Okay, so we're nearly there. Some final thoughts. Yeah, as a chartered architectural technologist, you will have a broad range of knowledge and experience of building regulation compliance, but Do most of you have the skills and behaviours necessary to achieve coordination, cooperation and communication throughout the team? Okay. The principal designer role is broad. You need to have an extensive grounding in the relevant legal and technical frameworks. You probably have. A breadth of knowledge to critically assess, appraise and challenge work. You probably have. Appropriate systems and processes in place to monitor and record compliance. That's probably where you're starting to struggle a bit. You know, how do you do that? How do you track stuff? You know, how do you track compliance? How do you sign off, you know, compliance? How do you assess where there is non-compliance and get people on board to get an answer to it and get rid of those non-compliances? And you've got to have personal integrity and responsibility to be able to communicate openly and effectively. The integrity bit is where I fall down, obviously. But anyway, that's basically what you need. And what I've done is I've taken out a few bits and pieces out of the application form just to get you to kind of, we can talk around this, John, because I did this last night. But so how do you decide what projects to undertake and decline as a practice, as an individual? You know, what's your process for adjudication of a request for a fee quote? Yeah. How do you establish who is the client, who the client is, and if they are aware of their duties? Right. Some of you might not realise that if the initial certificate for building regs, it's got to say who the client is, and it's not most forms out there, and there are different forms, but most approved inspectors, as you know them, or they're now called registered building regulation approvers for some reason. Some of them ask for the name, and if the name doesn't match the compliance certificate at the end of the job, they won't give you the final certificate. So you need to find out who the client is, person, right? And if they are aware of their duties, it's one of the requirements. It's actually in CDM and it gets overlooked all the time, but designers and contractors are obliged to ensure that the client is aware of their duties before they start any design or construction work. Okay, how's that done? How do you do it? Okay, how do you prove to clients your organizational, personal competence and resource? Have you got a competence statement? Have you got a CV that says you are a registered PD, which is what you're going for? Yeah. How do you establish and record the competence and resource of other designers? So the client, it says in there that you as a PD must assist the client in establishing the competence of the other stakeholders if you're requested to do so. So how do you do that? Those of you who do CDM, you're already, you know, way down the road and should be doing that anyway. How do you define, monitor and record the required management requirements? So as a CDM principal designer, I put out a pre-construction information pack as part of the tender documents, which says what the management requirements are, what information we got, what the risks are, etc., etc. There's a requirement to do a control plan. It actually states it in the regulations that you need to put out a control plan as part of the tender documents, which says all of that. How do you manage it? What are the risks? What are the non-compliances on building regulations? You know, who's designing what are the responsibilities for design? So a lot of you would be on D&B projects where a lot of the design is done by the specialist subcontractors. So they need to be competent as well. Who's checking that? What information are they providing? How do you coordinate all that into the final design?
And it might be that you need to put into, say, whoever's doing the actual contracts, an element or a few lines in there to say, as part of your tender process, please provide evidence that you have X, Y, and Z competence, depending on what the build and what the construction is, and that you have suitably qualified design managers, because they might be taking the PD role on if it's a D&B thereafter. So you will hand over your principal designer pack to them, and then they become the principal contractor, and they have the lovely job there of taking it forward.
Yeah. You know, one of the other things there is also if your client is saying they want the principal contractor to be the PD in the construction phase, that's fine, but they've got to be competent. You know, just remember that one. Everyone wants to kind of shift their responsibilities sideways. You can't unless they're competent. How do you define, monitor, and record the required management requirements? Yeah. How do you identify risks to compliance? How do you track, control, and record design decisions, including variations? So one of the requirements in there is if you've got change orders coming through, what is the responsibility? I've had numbers of arguments with project managers where you say, okay, you're going to put out a change order. It should note on there what the CDM implications are and what the BSA implications are. Does it change any risks, any non-compliances? It only takes a line to say no change or no effect, or oh yeah, by changing this, you know, the means of escape has got longer, or whatever. Yeah. You know, you don't need war and peace on it. All you need is a note to say this needs to be coordinated. How do you coordinate the design process and ensure proactive cooperation and communication between all parties? So, you know, you've got design team meetings, you've got workshops, you've got emails, you've got all sorts of ways to do it. I'm sure you know more ways than I do, but, you know, it's just obvious. Most of the questions are obvious. Ensure that the relevant notices and declarations are correctly issued. You know, I keep picking up the initial notice has got the project manager's name down as the client. And when you point it out, they go, well, I'm not the client. I say, well, you're now responsible. You know, if something goes wrong, it's down to you, mate, because you're the client. Yeah. So how do you check that? You know, did you know, for argument's sake, that if the client changes or any one of the principal design or the contractor changes, you have to make a declaration of change of duty holder. So the building regulation approver has to do that. You know, how do you track all of that lot? How do you collect, collate, and distribute information? Yeah, I must admit, I absolutely hate common data environments, but you know, just designing something and dumping it on a common data environment is not communication. It doesn't assist two-way communication. You know, so how do you do that? How do you manage that, especially on larger projects? How do you provide a client with a document explaining arrangements you put in place to plan, manage, and monitor the design work, coordinate design, and work and liaise with the PC? So where does that come from? If you look in Regulation 11 of the amendment regulations, it says within 28 days of the end of your appointment as a PD, you have to give the client a report that says how you do all that. And again, that's all forgotten. It's being missed. Yeah. And then the last one is, how do you measure success? So those are the types of questions that, you know, I've been sitting there as a PD thinking, how do I do this? You know, and reading applications that I've had through, you know, over the period, I sit there and think, oh, John and I were talking about this the other day. We'd sit there and we'd answer those differently to what we answered them in the first place when we made our applications. So, you know, this is all ongoing. Everyone is learning at the moment because there is no real guidance out there about what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. So, you know, everyone's doing it. It's a learning exercise through experience, and that's how we're doing it.
I think going through it over the last year since the legislation came in, I think we've found that there are now methodologies which pretty much everyone can agree on how you track and how you control and how you record. I think it's the softer skills and the common data environment some of the softer skills about what is appropriate, how do you do it. So for instance, when we're putting a design team together, if we're now looking at a larger project, we're looking at getting all of the contractors, all of the designers, depending on what type of contract it is, to sign a common agreement to say, yep, I will ensure that I meet my requirements of my role. I will declare anything which I don't see as appropriate for the job, or if it doesn't meet the requirements of building regs, or if there is a conflict with another party, you know, I will hold my hand up and say, we've got a problem here, and everybody shares the problem. It's just how you manage that, and it might not be appropriate for your jobs, but it's you know, looking at the softer skills is quite a difficult one. Yeah, every client is different. Every client doesn't want to pay for the role and the job, and doesn't want to overpay for doing too many things. So it's just about getting your paperwork in line so that you can prove how you've done it and the way you've done it. That's kind of the key thing, and that's what we need to see and what we need to know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, picking up on what John's just said, one of the things that we brought in, one of the processes, is that at the end of a project, there is a compliance declaration made by the client, the principal designer, and the principal contractor to say that the management arrangements were put in place by the client, that the design was coordinated by the principal designer, and it was built in accordance with the regulations by the principal contractor. So what we do is we go out there and get similar compliance statements or declarations from the designers. Has that been designed and built in accordance with the regulations? Otherwise, I won't sign it. I won't sign the final declarations of PD, because I'm having to underwrite their responsibilities. So again, behaviours. Okay, these are the things you need to think about. I think that's enough said on that lot, isn't it, John?
I think so. I think there's,
I think we've bored them silly.
There's a million things that can be asked and answered. So I think we'll take a step back and
I keep hearing notifications of people asking questions, James. So
yeah, so there's a few. I mean, some of them are coming up. You really probably need to ask technical at CIAT.global or practice at CIAT.global. With anyone that's put in an application for registration, it's been peer reviewed, and we've offered support and guidance to those individuals, and we're happy to put people in contact with the likes of Pete and John, who are willing to be mentors and give a bit of a steer. But ultimately, like it would be for chartership or for fellow, you need to do a contextualised written application with supporting evidence to demonstrate your capability and competence to fulfil the role. And the decision that's been determined at this point, if you're not on the register, is that further contextualised narrative and or evidence is required to enable us to go through the next phase of the process. You know, as I alluded to in the slides, everyone for HRB registration has to sit a professional review interview. And at the moment, or at any time, we do have the option to call any non-HRB registrant for a professional review interview as well. But the other questions really, I think, are individual ones. So Don was asking about, you know, how do you determine competence of others, and is them being a charter professional sufficient for them to demonstrate competence? Ultimately, I would say that's the process you undertake, Don, would be for you to determine as to whether that's demonstrating competence. I don't know what Pete or John want to say on that one.
So I've just had that process on one particular engineer who said, yes, I'm chartered. I did go back to their chartered body and check, and they weren't. So yeah, always check what people say, and then check their experience, and then try and prove that.
Yeah. The other thing is, sorry, John. The other thing is that remember that competence is a measure of skills, knowledge, experience, behaviours, and organisational capability. So those are what you've got to go and test. So ask questions. You know, how do you coordinate? How do you issue your drawings? How do you do whatever? So you're doing exactly what we're doing with you and asking pertinent questions. It's very difficult. I did pay a much more learned guy than me to do to give me some questions, a questionnaire, put together a questionnaire so I could do competence for BSA, and he came out with 40 pages of it, which obviously is you know, just way over the top, and we can't use it because, you know, people just won't do it. You know, there's other measures. There's things like SSIPs. You know, are you quality assured? BS 9001. You know, these are all kind of measures that you can put in place. I mean, there's one for the building control approver. You know, they're supposed to be for the stuff that I do, non-HRB stuff. They're supposed to be at least to level 3 on their own registration. You know, are they members of professional institutes, like in their case, CABE? You know, there's lots of questions you can ask, but don't forget it's the processes as well. You know, and then what other jobs have you successfully managed? You know, so skills. What skills have you got? You know, I'm a great bloke, and I know what I'm doing. I've got ways in which I can run workshops, and you know, we track stuff, etc. They're all skills you've got, soft skills, whatever. Your knowledge, well, you've obviously got knowledge, but you know, what CPD are you doing? What other training courses have you got? Those types of things. Experience, we said, what jobs have you done personally? And then behaviours we spoke about.
Will they be the actual person doing the job? Because yeah, it's great to go out to person X, but will they be doing the actual day-to-day work, or is, you know, who's doing it and what's their knowledge and experience, or what's, you know, not just what's the lead in time, you know, given a project can be 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, 4 years, you know,
yeah,
what's the stability of the
other one obviously is insurance as well. Are you insured to do it, and what are the exclusions in that insurance? Because there's loads of the insurers will exclude fire, you know, contamination, asbestos. There's loads of exclusions out there, and those that go out and get PI insurance know what they are.
Yeah, I would agree. That's one of the big things which we've had to look at and deal with, and we're insured only up to 11 meters for fire. So any projects above 11 meters, we have to have a fire engineer on board, and we have to look at their competencies. And we've gone out to the market to look at other fire engineers, and some of those we've gone and looked at their insurance. Some of them don't have the right level of cover for what we need to do. So it's having the sort of ability to go and check requirements and make sure it's right for your project, and write all that down and say,
yeah, you have to record
person X. We found out, you know, they've got this level of cover. They're willing to take on the liability. There you go. We've done that element of the competence check. There's a lot to it above, over and above what just doing some building regs drawings.
Yeah. Any more, Jay?
Good. Right. Well, I'll just note that Jay's got his hand up. Jay, you have shared some opinions in the chat with us, and we have had people assisting you through your application. So by all means, you can ask a query about registration, or you can catch up with Nora and I after this meeting via email. So it's really up to you.
So I think it's fair to say, James, that we're not you know, as assessors, we're not looking to defer anyone. The whole point of this is to get people to understand what skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours they have got. Because you know, a lot of us don't recognise it because no one tells us you're good at something or you're bad at something. So this is all about you figuring it out for yourself, and then you know, if you can't, we'll help. You don't want to defer or turn down anyone. It's just getting more competence into the industry. You know, and I personally think chartered technologists are in the best position.
Yeah, but it might be that you don't have the required skills and knowledge now. It might be that you're early in your chartered career and you haven't had to manage any projects. You haven't had that experience. You might not have had much client interaction. So you might be a few years away yet if you're quite new to the sort of chartered element of the industry.
Okay, so yeah, Jay's question is what happens if you get a third deferral? So for anyone that's putting in an application, you get 3 opportunities through your written application, your evidence to meet the criteria. generally at a first or second deferral stage where we need further evidence or a revised narrative for clarifications and you're not sure what we're asking for, then we'll put you in contact with the likes of John or Peter or another assessor that does the verifications for us. But if you get a third submission and you're not meeting the criteria, then that's your opportunities with that application to meet the criterion for registrations. You'd have to come back and submit a new application and pay the fee again. But we'd like to think, Jay, with the people that we put you in contact with, they've been able to assist you and hopefully looked at every potential revision to your application before it comes in again to enable you for registration. The process is here to help chartered architectural technologists demonstrate competence and get the relevant registration. But the robustness and the standards need to be met against all the criteria within the competency framework, depending on whether you're going for non-HRB or HRB registration. Now, if you get HRB registration, then you de facto get non-HRB registration because you have to meet the criteria and above to go through that process. And the idea of Pete and John doing it is that one's got one registration and one's got both. So it's quite a good opportunity to ask any general questions about registrations. But because it's quite a small cohort at the moment, we don't really have a pre-review mentoring process set up for this strand of registration within CIAT, Martin, of what you're asking for. It's more so if you do the best of your endeavours to get your application to the point where you submit and we will then review it, you'll get your if it's not successful, you'll get your first deferral, and at that point you'll get a steer as to what's lacking, what further information is required, and therefore you can look to resubmit. And if you're still not sure, then you might ask myself or Nora or Lily that manage the register, can I speak to someone about this? Because I just want to make sure the second time around I'm on the right track to get registration, if you see what I mean. So a bit like we would for chartership, do your best to address the criteria and evidence it, send it in for review. We're not going to say you failed, you haven't met the criteria, you won't ever meet the criteria. We're saying that we've looked at it, we need these clarifications, these refinements, this evidence, and if you give us that, that will enable you to proceed for registration or chartership, depending on what process we're talking about. So it's a collaborative process to help you get to that point to be determined competent to act as a PD in this specific instance.
I think just looking at a couple of the questions in there, does all the evidence need to be from a live project? Live in terms of historic, not necessarily live right now. It can be from multiple projects, which have all had various different elements which show you've met through your time in practice the different requirements.
Yeah, well, people are asking, you know, is there a mentor to look at their applications? I can't say whether your application meet the standard. Whether Pete wants to put his hand up and say maybe, but then there's a lot of people in the room, and Pete's and John have got day jobs and practices to run. So our preference, and I think I'm answering for everybody here, would do your best to address the criteria, evidence your competencies, get it to the point where you're comfortable that you've demonstrated your competence, submit it formally, and in worst case, we'll just ask for further clarifications and or evidence to enable you to get registration. And if at that point you're struggling, then we can look at allocating someone to give you a bit of a steer to get you to the point of registration.
Yeah, no one's going to think you're an idiot if you don't answer all the questions correctly, or you don't give it sufficient evidence to be able to be registered on your first application. You know, this is all about a learning curve. So that first slide I put up where I said, you know, you've got this fear of failure. I know I sat there, you know, oh, it's a Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists, and I don't want to, you know, get this wrong because then I don't look, you know, professional, etc. It doesn't matter. Get your application in. If there's something in there which, you know, doesn't make sense to us, or we think you need a little bit more, you know, meat on the bones, we'll tell you. It's not a problem.
I think
You
there is an
just need to
exemplar.
go for it. But what you've got to understand, and as you know, a summary on my side is that the world has changed. You know, that's what's good about the Building Safety Act. As I said to you before, I personally don't agree with a lot of stuff in. It's too complex by half. You know, it's been written by lawyers, and you know, we're all practical people, and they don't give a lot of practical advice to you. So we're all learning. So go for it. You've got the technical knowledge there. Just go for it.
There is the exemplar documentation, and there is the guidance notes, and all of that I think is pretty well. It's getting a lot clearer for applicants. I think when we first started it, was 12 of us grilling each other, sitting around a table, and that was that was scary. You guys have got it a little bit easier.
Yeah. So the application forms, we've looked at those recently, and we've given a bit more flexibility on word limits, because some candidates in this room and externally were saying the word limit was quite tight. So there's a bit more space or leeway on the word limits if you look at the current version published on the website, which I've put in the chat. There's also a matrix document that we've put together with the likes of Peter and John, where you can map all the relevant documents against each of the respective criteria, depending on the registration you're going for. So that helps you give you a good overview of what documents you're using to meet each point. And it gives us and the assessors a good overview of the documents in your application that are going to tick off all the criteria, and you need to do your best to show your ability to meet the criteria. But we are also mindful that certain stages haven't necessarily come through in reality just yet, such as Gateway 3 applications with the BSR, and there's quite a few hold-ups at Gateway 2, etc., etc. So we do take a level of pragmatism to an assessment and to a verification, and to enable people to get registration. Ultimately, if you're fulfilling the role, we want to encourage you as chartered architectural technologists to get onto the register, and we want to support you to get onto the register. And we will do what we can within the realms of what we've got capacity-wise for the likes of John and Peter that are doing this in a voluntary capacity for the greater good of the profession and the discipline. So we will try and help everybody that comes through. You're doing it for the love, Peter. We've discussed this earlier.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, just to give people an awareness, it might take you, I don't know, a day, 2 days even, to write up your evidence for submission. Yeah, we've got to read all that, understand it, and then mark it and assess it. So the more clarity you can provide using the matrix documentation and actually setting out, I've met this criteria, paragraph 1, 2 of my evidence, and make it as clear as possible. That makes our job a lot easier and more enjoyable.
And just remember, plan, manage, monitor, record. You made a decision. How was that planned out? How did you manage it? Who did you tell? What evidence have you got for it? Etc. Etc. It's that process.
Okay, I think at that point we're probably going to propose to stop the recording. So for anyone that's had technical issues, we're going to publish this on the website sometime this week, and you can come back to it at any point. And as they've alluded to, look at the guidance notes, look at the form, evaluate your proficiency, your capability, and then look to apply. The only thing I would state now is that we're stopping receiving applications at the end of January until the 1st of May, because at the moment we're not charging a subscription for PD registration, but it's likely there will be one charge from the 1st of May. So if you're getting your application in, then it needs to be by the 31st of January this year, in advance of the new subscription year on the 1st of May. So we won't be taking any applications for that 3-month period. So you can determine whether that sits for what deadline you want to aim for. But you do need to be a chartered architectural technologist to apply. So if there's any associates, affiliates, or non-members in the room, you have to get qualified first to benchmark your level before you can apply for registration. But anyone that wants to reach out to Nora, myself, or Lily, you've got our details. And I'm a great believer, if you don't ask, you don't get. So even if you ask a question, it might be a yes, it might be a no, or it might be we know someone that can help. So please don't be afraid to get in touch, and we look forward to you getting on the register in the near future if that's what you're planning to do. And thank you, Peter and John.
Any feedback helps us make it, an even easier and better, better process.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. Hopefully that's helped.
Yeah, thank you. And